Hi there. My name is Dr. Kim Ernest. I'm a licensed psychologist and licensed professional counselor. I'm the president of Pennsylvania Counseling Services, the founder of Live Up Counseling, and today we're going to be talking about romantic relationships and all the ways it either serves or impedes our quest for happiness.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Roque. I have a bachelor's in psychology and criminal justice, and I'm also a certified family-based therapist in Pennsylvania. I work for PA Counseling in Family Base as a therapist, and I've been working here for over 12 years.
Hello, I go by many different names. Mary, Sebastian, Bastion. Feel free to call me whatever. I am currently waiting with bated breath to take the clinical social work test. So soon I'll be an LCSW, hopefully. And I am an independent contractor for Live Up Counseling. I also have started my own business, which I have yet to do anything with, but soon, once I get my clinical license. My other private practice is Nothing About Us Without Us, Creative Arts Therapies. And I also am a performance artist whenever I can find the time.
Hi, I am Allison Ruvalo. I have, just as recently, my master's of science and mental health and wellness, and I work in the Lebanon Middle School, now it's called Intermediate School, as a school-based therapist. I have been working there since last August, so.
Nice. So, as we sort of lead in today, I don't know that we're obviously looking down the barrel to the national love holiday of Valentine's Day. I am so personally invested in this concept of different attachment constructs and how that sort of drives us closer to and further away to our own happiness and satisfaction within relationships. And so I'm going to do a quick on attachment. I think we did this once before, but for those who are seeking to better understand how different attachment based pieces may take us closer to or further away. So essentially, attachment is considered as a sort of categorical construct, suggesting that we fall into one of four different categories when it comes to our attachment style. Spoiler alert, I think categories are bullshit when it comes to human beings. I don't think many of us do fit into categories. So while attachment is often talked about categorically, I often conceptualize it much more dimensionally. I also think dimensional conceptualizations of attachment have a tendency to be a little bit more strengths focused and also recognizes that we don't arrive in a category and stay there, but rather subsequent relationships within our romantic experiences, I think, can take us closer to or further away from secure attachment. So I think once upon a time, the belief about attachment was that and that comes out of the literature from John Bowlby, right? Once upon a time, it was believed that those first 2 years were seminal in our development. And then once we hit that 2 year mark, we were kind of crystallized in our attachment. But the research has shown it's not really like that. Truthfully, our experiences across our relationships and our lifespan can alter and shift those constructs that we develop in our brains. But to speak to it categorically, first and foremost, there's that secure attachment base. These folks have a tendency to be more comfortable with emotional intimacy and closeness, have a tendency to have more stable, fulfilling relationships, can communicate more effectively, can navigate conflict more constructively. When I think about it in sort of that dimensional model, in terms of their esteem or self-esteem, they have a tendency to have slightly higher self-esteem in relationships or more stable self-esteem in relationships. They also have more stable other esteem in relationships, meaning their perceptions is that the other is going to care for them and show up for them for the most part. So that's kind of the belief with which they enter into relationships. The next sort of category that I want to talk or speak to is this anxious attachment, sometimes also called preoccupied attachment. This is one of the insecure attachment patterns that we could see emerge. Typically, those who fall into this particular category have a tendency to have higher other esteem, so they see the other as being more valuable, but really low self-esteem. Sometimes what this can look like is what can be experienced as a more excessive need for reassurance or a more fear-based connection. Hey, I'm an anxious attachment person,
my.
like in recovery. So it can lead to higher relationship stress. It can cause more emotional ups and downs, more struggles with trust or feelings of insecurity. This can sometimes emerge because early childhood experiences were unpredictable. So sometimes their needs were met, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they experienced their needs as being too excessive, which ultimately impedes their own ability to feel like grounded and connected in relationships. We also have our avoidant attachment folks. So these individuals really struggle with emotional intimacy, may be less reluctant to feel connected to those. And when somebody really wants to rely on them, their spidey senses might start to tingle and their defenses go up. They might be more likely to kind of ghost or withdraw from a close attachment relationship. They may struggle to commit. They may prioritize their own independence. They may create emotional distance within important relationships, leading to difficulties with romantic bonds. So these might be those folks that are more likely to characterize their emotional needs as an island. They might not want that connection. These folks might have early on learned that they need to be more independent. So that early childhood experience might have been characterized by them needing to be more independent, and maybe even their needs being treated as excessive or unnecessary. So they learned pretty early on, the only person I can count on is me, and I'm a count on me. And then last but not least, of the more attachment styles that fall in that less secure base, we have our disorganized attachment styles. So these folks kind of combine anxious and ambivalent. There's a lot of kind of come here, go away vibes. In terms of esteem and dimensionality, they might be lower on self esteem. They might also be lower on other esteem. So they don't necessarily see themselves as being exceptionally skilled in navigating romantic or intimate interpersonal relationships. They might also not necessarily see others as a safe place to have their emotional needs met. So these folks tend to be rather insulated and ultimately may struggle to sustain and develop long-term emotional connections. So those are the big attachment pieces. There's a lot of different ways attachment styles can get in the way of our happiness, but I want to open it up. How do you all see attachment relationships, and specifically the romantic relationship, as taking us closer to or further away from our goals of our own quest for happiness?
If I can make a joke,
Yeah.
I feel like the catchphrase for anxious attachment is, "Do you hate me?"
Yeah.
Yeah. As they find themselves stuck in that like come here, go away vibe. Um,
And I also have definitely experienced and also witnessed the stereotype of anxious attachment with an avoidant attachment. It seems like they draw each other together for some reason.
oh yeah. I would say that's been the most common composition. I mean, doing couples work, working with couples in therapy is my favorite thing. I love doing couples work. I very often see that combination of somebody with a more avoidant attachment pattern and someone with a more anxious attachment pattern, and they find each other and then they come to therapy, and neither of them are having their needs met within the relationship, despite the fact they might really love one another. But when times get tough, they tend to evoke in one another the one thing that the other really doesn't need right now, like the one thing that the other really doesn't need in that moment. And yet they find one another and have babies with each other, buy houses together, and then find themselves in therapy.
I just often think with what you said too, I think it really also goes off of how you were raised or your early on attachments. So even like in family based, we don't do couples work,
Yeah.
but also we do in a way. I just can't say I do, but I do in a way.
Do co-parenting sessions.
Thank you. That's exactly what it's called on the note. But yes, so because you have to address that piece in terms of overall family functioning. But I find when I'm doing like a history timeline for caregivers, more likely than not, what they're also showing is what they were showed as kids. So it's very difficult for a lot of people that if you don't understand attachment and you were raised a certain way and you haven't done work to learn different attachment styles or learned how to work into getting into healthy relationships, you mimic what your parents shown you or the people in your lives have shown you. So often when I find when we go back to the root, like how they saw relationships growing up and things like that, a lot of times we can find success in them identifying like what kind of attachment style they have, what kind they go along with, and then really what they need to do to work with their partner in a way that'll help both of them come out of whatever the issue is. But I just always go back to the attachment styles as a baby. And I'm also, what we were just talking about it, 15 months as a new mom. So I'm reading all about attachment. Like I want to make sure she's attached to us and, it has a secure attachment because we're the model right now for what she's going to see and how she's going to develop when she gets older. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that, the whole, really the upbringing. And not that you can't change it, but it's really what you see is where you learn what you're doing. So
No, the running joke in our house between my husband and I is we just want to do 10% better than our parents did. Whatever, and recognizing and to some degree, not accepting, but
Right.
acknowledging that we're in many ways sort of destined or predestined to play out a lot of the same patterns that we came up with, and a lot of those same patterns emerge despite our awareness, despite our knowledge that we find ourselves trapped in those same patterns. And then as long as we can do it just a little bit better, we see ourselves as at least breaking some of those intergenerational patterns or in some degree like diluting some of the toxicity that was given to us. And in hopes, like I think my husband and I are very cognizant because we both grew up in households in which our caregivers would fight with one another in front of the children. My husband and I are very cognizant of like, we don't fight in front of our kids. And sometimes that means that like trouble stacks up or like when we're not intentional about it, there's downsides to that as well. Like resentments will stack up, frustrations will stack up, but we have a pretty firm rule. Like we're not going to do this in front of the kids, but we have to make sure we create space to do it because we do need to come back to it, but life gets busy, right? So that's our way to do like better than our parents. And then if we're not really intentional about saying and coming back to it later, we can find that kind of stacks up and gets in our own way. And then we become our parents after all. So, best laid plans, but how do you do it?
But even I want to just like, touch on that again. So I grew up in a household where there was no arguing, but what happened was like I grew up not really understanding how you can argue with someone effectively and have a different opinion just because my parents grew up in pretty toxic households. So they took it to the extreme and they were like, we're never going to have an argument in front of our kids. So I think it was only like 16, maybe 15 when I first heard my parents like argue. And I really struggled up until like college when I had conflicts with people. I would avoid. I'm like, well, I don't know how to do it, and it followed me into relationships. And I really just had no idea just because they really didn't show us that piece. So when we look back on it now, because I can talk to my parents about all this stuff, they're like, we should have had those discussions in front of you. Like some of them, healthy arguments or disagreements, just so that my sister and I could understand, because that was definitely lacking. Like, I feel like that's the other side of things when you grow up with two parents that don't argue at all. Or they were arguing, just not in front of us. But, it was very difficult trying to navigate how to have a healthy disagreement with someone growing up.
I really relate to that a lot because I grew up with not the best parents in some ways. And really only saw the negative arguing. But now with my fiance, I have so much cognitive dissonance around, wait, we just argued and everything's fine? What?
Right. That's
I'm so
yeah,
confused.
yeah.
And then
yeah.
after and my fiance and I don't really have that many arguments, but we had one recently that was pretty challenging, but my fiance was so happy afterwards. I couldn't understand it. And they were like, well, but you listened to me. I felt heard and listened to him. Like, okay, well, I was just sitting there crying, but cool. Glad that it worked. I'll have to process this.
Yeah.
It's also weird, the phrase, I'm still tripping over it, even though an ex of mine said it to me over 10 years ago. I'm mad at you, but I still love you. Again, cognitive dissonance. What?
Yeah, that is really important. I agree with you both. I feel like it's so interesting because you go throughout life, like, just acting like a child and going through life's motions and everything. And then when you get into a relationship with somebody that's like that avoidant and you're that attachment and you're just like, why are we opposites? But then you really like dig into it. Okay, well, they were, their parents were like this and mine were like that. So when we come together, it's more of like an issue and we can work on it. I'm more of the attachment and my boyfriend is more the avoidant. But like you said, Kim, we meet in the middle. But that is more of like the, I'm looking for the attachment more. He's just kind of like, I love you. But like, so it is interesting, especially with kids, you see it. But then when you get older, when you actually do form romantic relationships, it's like, oh, this is why I am the way I am. This is the why, because everything, parents and, just how you were raised and what you saw. So it definitely is interesting.
They actually, when I was preparing for this podcast, that was one of the downsides of attachment patterns is our ability to repeat toxic relationship patterns, and like just those cycles that we find ourselves in. I think part of it's almost zooming out and being able to see those patterns. And I think sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you struggle to see it. You know what I mean? Like you don't have the viewpoint. So at least it's funny, I forgot to put on my wedding band. And I can't
hate when
do
that
the attachment podcast. I was running late this morning. So like I always put on my jewelry last and I didn't I
That happens to me all the time.
forgot to put on my wedding band. I offered to get a tattoo for my husband. I said, listen, I forget to put on my wedding band a lot. If you want me to tattoo myself, I'll do that. Just so we don't do this. And he's like, nah, I don't want a tattoo. You can wear your band when you remember. But I forgot this morning. But I would say also I'm in a different season of relationship with my husband. Like we dated for 3 years. We've now been married. It'll be 13 this year. We've had 2 kids. We've moved across the country. We've done couples therapy. And I would say when we entered into a relationship, we both had a more avoidant attachment pattern. But things worked out it's funny. You can have a really good avoidantly attached relationship for quite some time because you both are really used to being self-sufficient.
Right.
And so there never is that person like chasing the other. There's no conflict
right.
because when times get tough, you both just are like, well, I can do it myself then. And that was always each of our vibes. But then it was 5 years ago now, in 2020, we both had significant attachment losses. My husband lost his dad in July, and then 2 months later, my brother passed away. And so we both had these losses from our family of origin that just kind of shakes everything up. And what we noticed is that our pre-existing attachment patterns of like toxic independence were really activated by those losses. And so we went from having distance when times got tough to being separate. And so we ended up going to an attachment focused couples therapist. We went to an EFT provider for probably about 8 or 9 months. It was fantastic. It was really, really helpful. And that's what we needed to come back together. But we were able to live in an avoidant attachment relationship for some time because there was no conflict baked into it. We both were like, you don't want to be here? Fine. Like, I'm used to that. I can do this myself then. Like, kind of that hell I won't vibes. Like, that's kind of what we both gave off. And it was working for a season until it didn't.
Seems to me like one of the best things one can do in any relationship is like intentionality and, of course, communication. Because I always think about how human beings biologically are supposed to attach for safety. So biologically, in my mind, means it's going to be pretty strong. And then I feel like when then you get in a relationship, those emotions are so strong. Like I think you were saying something to the effect of getting like lost in it. And then it's a lot harder to be intentional because you're just so concerned about, but I need that attachment love. And then you forget to use I statements or whatever.
You're also early in relationships, like almost high. And I think people
Yeah.
acknowledge
Yeah,
that. Like
absolutely.
early in romantic relationships, your brain is flooded
saying that.
with chemicals that like make you a little high.
Yes.
Like you're not high, but like
No, it's so true.
you're not, you're
Yeah.
crazy a little bit in those early romantic times. I think so.
That always really sucked for, I guess, me and maybe other anxious attachment people because I really dislike it when I have a friend or a partner, whoever, that consented to something and then comes back later and is like, well, actually, I changed my mind. And when you're high in the beginning of a relationship, oftentimes you'll be like, yeah, sure, this person's so great, I'll do whatever they want. And then a couple months later, you're like, actually, I don't like that. And you're like, well, were you lying the whole time? I'm like, no, I was just high.
It's a big
Stoned my own brain chemistry.
Yeah.
That's a big thing in my relationship. Like I have struggled with is like it is a high because I've been told too, like, oh, like, you know, you were like acted a certain way in the beginning of our relationship and you're not like that anymore. And it's like you're in such a high that you're like, it's not that like you get mean or anything, but it's like you're this like, I have to impress this person. I have to act a certain way. I'm so in love with you. And then it's like once you start getting comfortable in front of people, it's like, all right, like your true self comes out. And that's where it kind of gets a little messy sometimes.
I still have bouts of being high though. I really do. Like
Got a baby.
I
It comes
mean,
back. Got a baby.
I think about it too, like till this, I think I may have said this on a different podcast too. Till this day, if I'm coming home, my husband gets home before me, I always look in the mirror in like the rear view and I'm always like, okay, all right. And why do I do that? The guys that see me give birth, okay, at my worst look, okay, but I still till this day, like I'm always like, okay. And even if I'm home before him and the Life 360 app tells me he's about to be home, I get butterflies. I really do. So I feel like I still have bits of high. I really do. I tell him all the time. It's so weird. Not that I wish I was over it, but I know I still have that. Like, and I love it. I hope it doesn't go away, but it is kind of annoying sometimes. And I'm like, why do I care so much? I don't know, but I do. I check the way I look. I make sure I'm okay. I'm like, all right. Even though he sees me wake up with bad breath, bad hair, like it doesn't matter, but I still have, I feel like bits of the high for sure.
I think that's important to like date night or whatever, or do yourself
Yes.
up here and there. Like my fiance has said that to me, like, hey, will you wear such and such outfit because I like it? Or like, I love when my fiance puts their hair down because I love long hair. And it's weird because it's like the novelty of it, at least for like neurodivergent brains like mine, novelty is great because it gives you that dopamine. So if my fiance is constantly having their hair up to bring it down, it's like, oh, it's so cool.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
When I think those like moments of magic show up in any, I mean, they should in any healthy relationship
Right.
at times. My fear is that they will show up, and maybe this has not been your experience, but I think like the research suggests that we produce less of like the oxytocin and like some of those cuddle
See what you're saying.
hormones after the first, it's PEA is like the big one that is produced early in relationships. That's the one. That's the chemical that's most, it's tied to stalking. So the craziness, right? A lot of folks that are charged with stalking, when they researched that more fully, they had just like overblown amounts of PEA in their
I did not know
brains.
that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
hilarious.
yeah. But it's also the cuddle hormone that your brain produces even more of it for the 2 years after you have a baby. So that increases again. And it's designed, right, from an evolutionary perspective. I think you already referenced that if like the two primary attachment figures for that child's life, like when a woman has a baby, it increases that PEA production in mom, but also mom's partner. It increases the PEA production if partner is involved, and it increases them not just towards the baby, but towards one another. And it would make sense that when a baby's like most useless, which is in its first 2 years of life, right, there's no more useless infant than the human baby. Like look at it. I'm being funny, but I'm not being
No,
funny.
it's true. They can't be outside like other like
No.
other species.
Like
or
a horse is
anything.
born,
Like, you
it
can't-
can run.
Yeah,
the
A
very
that's
least,
true.
zebra
They can
is
walk.
born, it
You're
can
right.
run. A baby's born,
You're right.
At
give
the
it
very
3
least,
years
a
and it
primate
can
can
maybe
hold
crawl.
on. A baby can't even hold on to its
Yeah,
mom.
sloths hold on to their
Exactly.
moms. Like, so
And
true.
because babies are born too early. Like there is that 4th trimester that we should talk about more where they're not ready to be outside the womb anyway. But what I've read is that babies are born at 9 months instead of like 12 to 13 months where they would be more developmentally ready for the outside world because the head's too big and a woman's birth canal could not give birth
So
to a
true.
baby when it needs to be. So like we figured it out from an evolutionary perspective. But infants are useless and you need PEA to give those infants the best shot they've got, which is a dual caregiver household kind of if that PEA can increase their attachment to one another as well, then that gives that infant the best odds of success
Absolutely.
despite the fact they can't even hold on. Like
I also think, as the point you started with, that's why it's important to take breaks from your partner or whatever relationship you have. Like, don't be around each other constantly, because then you will have that. I forget if it's habituation. I think, not dishabituation. You'll just get too used to them. But like then if you like pandemic. Pandemic was great in a weird sense because right before that is when I met my fiance. And then the pandemic hit just at the time that we were like really in that honeymoon period, but we couldn't see each other. But of course, that was the best thing. Then when we were able to see each other, the like chemistry and the electricity was like through the roof. But you had to have that
Moment of separation.
moment of separation in order to. So sometimes it's really hard, but sometimes we try to take intentional time away in order to get that high afterwards.
Very interesting.
I think
Very interesting.
couples that each have their own like interests and identities in that space tend to be the most long-term successful. Like I existed before I met my husband. If God forbid he was ever no longer in my life, I would continue to exist. And I think that has allowed us to continue like I don't know. If we were around each other 24/7 with none of our own individual interests and passions and that sort of thing, I could envision that getting really stale over time. I also, like, prior to my husband, I had relationships where I was like the sun, moon, and stars to them. And like I had shit to do. And that was annoying. That's not, like, I think people think that would be really appealing until you're in it. And then there's like, it's like, no, like I was in grad school when I was in that specific relationship, and it's like, no, I have shit to. Why don't you get a hobby
Right.
or like
Yeah, it's
Get
true.
up.
do a thing that doesn't like I have things to do. I don't want to do your things. Like go have a friend. I don't know, but
It is
get out of the
really
house.
important to have that hobby. Like my past relationship, I was with my ex for almost 4 years, and no, not hating anybody that plays video games, but like that was his thing all the time. So like he was always home. He worked from home. So like, and I was out, and then, but like my boyfriend now, he is into cars, motorcycles. So like, working on stuff. So like that's his separate thing. Like when we do get a house one day, I expect him to be in the garage, working on stuff, but I need to have that time for myself as well where, I'm busy because if we, are snowed in or something like that, we can't do anything. We like that together, that time together, but eventually we're like, all right, the both of us need to like find something to do because I'm losing my mind. Not because we don't love each other, but I think it's just we have different interests. And he's always said to me too, like when we first started dating, I was like, oh, I feel bad because I don't like the same thing. You like working on machines and like that stuff. And he's like, it's okay. Like, I don't want you to be into that stuff because I need a break from that as well. So it's like this happy medium of like, I'm glad you kind of don't like that stuff because like, I don't want to come home and talk about all the stuff that I just love all the time. I want to, be into what you're into. So we kind of like meet in the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's so weird because I had to learn early on as an adult, the one person can't be your everything.
Right.
But when you're an infant, one person has to be your,
Yeah.
or two people have to be your everything. So it's this weird journey of eventually being like, okay, which I think is one reason why either having other friends or other
Right,
hobbies, or
yes,
even
yep.
if you're poly, having more than one partner for different separate
Right,
needs. Because
right.
even the separate interests things, that could include different sexualities or romantic inclinations, complicated stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I make like he has a Harley, and he works on cars and stuff. So like I make, effort to learn about stuff and go over there and see what he's doing and stuff. But I think it definitely is important to have your own friends and have your own time with stuff you do because after a while you kind of not that you get bored of each other, but I think the distance helps a little bit. So it is important overall.
No, and I think this idea of the one versus, I think we live in a culture that prioritizes romantic attachments above any other type of attachment. I think we're socialized to
Yep.
really value that. I think especially for women. Um, but I think men, my husband always yells at me. He's like, "You think it's just always easier for men?" And I was like, "No, I do think it's always easier for men, but I won't say that." I think that women, though, I think are socialized a little bit differently when it comes
Yeah.
to growing up and the expectation that you'll get married and you'll have babies and you'll have this partner and, the white
Yep.
picket fence and the
Yep.
2 point and the golden retriever, all the things. And I think that there is a different level of internal pressure that in general societally is placed upon those born female than those born male in the United States at least. And so I think there is almost that like driving factor to you need to find a romantic partnership. You need to find a romantic partnership. And if you don't, I mean, I have friends that are very happily single. And like they don't want a relationship and they don't want like maybe they tried it and they're like, yeah, nah, I'm good here. Or they have like a dog and a job and really good friendships and they're like, this fills my bucket and this fills my cup so much more than a romantic relationship ever did. But yet I think we live in a culture where we place this relationship up on a pedestal compared to so many others. And I think there's a lot of risk with that. I think that means that people get into relationships in an effort to find that like white whale that isn't a whale at all. Like, honey, that's an octopus. I don't know, but it's not a whale that maybe doesn't serve them or stays in a relationship that no longer serves them longer. I don't know, but that's just my guess.
That was my exact relationship before I got into my marriage. Like, I was with my, it sounds so weird to say ex because that's over like 13, 15 years ago. But my last ex or whatever, we were together for 7 years. So all throughout like a little bit of high school and all throughout college. And it was always the expectation for me as not only for my culture of being a Hispanic female, but then also being in a household where it was just girls and my dad and like myself, my sister, my mom, my dad, but like them really instilling in us, you've got to find the perfect one. When you find someone, it's for marriage. So that's what you're dating for. And so I stayed in a really toxic relationship for 7 years. Now, it wasn't toxic the entire time, but the last 2 years of it, oh my gosh, I should have been left that relationship. But I was also like, well, I invested 5 years already. Why would I leave? This is the expectation of me. Let me keep going. I'm like 20, about to be 22. I need to get married soon, because my mom had me at 21. So like that was the pressure of not just society, but like my family. So, and them pressuring me to marry. And in my heart, I'm like, I know this isn't the one. Like, this is not the one I'm going to marry. But I kept going with this relationship. I fed into all those expectations.
How did your family respond? May I ask?
Oh my God,
how
of
your
course,
family
yeah.
responded when you ended that relationship?
So they were really surprised, but once I let them in, because I didn't live with them at that time, I was still in college, I kind of kept some things because I knew some of the things that were toxic. Like I didn't want to hear about it or talk about it. I was trying to avoid that. So my parents were really surprised because they really liked him. But when I started explaining the toxicity and the things that I was doing too that were toxic, they were like, why didn't you let us know? Like, you should have been left that. And I'm like, I know, but I invested so much time. And thankfully, like, due to me being a therapist for so long too, I've had so many conversations about my upbringing with my parents, like full circle healing, things like that. So I was able to talk to them about that, and they're like, oh, they felt bad. And I'm like, don't feel bad about it. Like, this is just the way you guys were also raised as well, but this is something I'm not going to instill. Like, it's just something I'm not going to do for my kids. But after being single for like a year and a half, then I met my husband at 15, but like we rekindled, and then it's been smooth sailing since. So but the societal pressures, the cultural pressures, that really hit me for 7 years, staying with not a good relationship. So, but yeah, they accepted it after they knew like the nitty gritty of it. But yeah, I get that.
Pressure is real.
Hard.
It is.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
I'm 27, and when me and my ex broke up, I can't even, I was probably, I'm 24, 25. And you see all this stuff on social media, and it's like people are together for years, and it's like, oh, here I am having to start all over again.
Yep.
And, as the older you get, and then you see people putting stuff on social media all the time, and it's like, all right, well, if I would have stayed, would I have been married by now? But
Yeah.
again, it wasn't like toxic to the point where I needed but it wasn't a good relationship. And again, I stayed because you build that relationship, and you're just like, I'm not happy, but here we are.
Yeah.
But no, it's like you kind of have to start over, and then, you see all that, people getting married and having kids, and it's kind of like, oh,
Yep.
but you just have to remind yourself, everybody's time is different. So it's important. And, talking about that with your partner too, like me and my boyfriend have had many talks, and, we've talked about marriage, and he's fully committed to that eventually. But I think having that talk with your partner, like, hey, like, this is how I feel. If I feel behind or anything, and, having them be like, listen, this is the timeline, I want to do this with you, A, B, and C, is really important, because if you don't talk about that with them, you might still feel like that emptiness of, hey, is this going to happen eventually?
So we're all therapists, and so I love that you're bringing this concept of like communication into the conversation. But I also would argue that as therapists trained in the models that we've been trained in, we are more skilled at communicate. Not to say I joke all the time that like psychologist Kim and mom Kim, or psychologist Kim and wife Kim, they don't fucking know each other. They've never met. Okay. And I do think there are certain, like my husband, if we are in the middle of a pretty nasty conflict, I do something that drives him absolutely crazy, which he calls my therapist voice.
Yep.
He says, you're using your therapist voice. And really what I'm using is my regulation voice. Like, I am trying to regulate right now.
Yes.
And so I self-soothe through information and facts and like cognitive distance from things that are driving me up a wall. So you can have therapist voice, or you can have crazy psycho voice. And which would you like in this moment?
I so heavily relate to that because
Are you therapizing me?
too.
Do you
yeah,
get
no,
that?
exactly.
I'm not your
Because
client.
I realized, I know very much so that because of my childhood experiences and trauma, whatever, that is why I'm a therapist, because I wanted to figure out why the people that were being mean to me were mean to me. So then it became this weird coping skill that, oh yeah, I know how to use I statements and this therapy thing and that therapy thing. So when I'm in a relationship, I'm going to try to make them do that too. Yeah, because I care about them, but also because I don't want you to be mean to me. And then in the relationship that I have now, there was a small handful of times where I definitely therapized my partner, and afterwards they were like, don't do that. That was terrible.
Yeah.
And like I was saying about the recent challenging conversation I had with my fiance, I did have the crazy psycho voice because I was upset. And my partner was like, Nia, I want that. I'd rather you be a real person than try to therapize me and be fake, which is kind of cool, but it's just challenging too. It's challenging to be your real self and to feel safe and comfortable with somebody.
Well, because then you're like, are you sure? Like, do you know what else comes with that? Like, I've worked a long time to use my therapist voice in conflict. Like, I've had a lot of my own therapy to have that be the voice that shows up when I'm dysregulated and feel like the attachment sand slipping from underneath my feet, which I think from like an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that when you feel like your like human is not on your side or not like when you feel that gap come between you and your human, like that is extremely dysregulating. And until I had my kids, I would almost describe it as like a more primal dysregulation. For me, now that I have had my children, I feel like I've now discovered like an even higher level of like dysregulation. Like if something stands between me and my kids, like I will eat your throat with my bare teeth to get to my kids. You know what I mean? Like my husband, like he can handle himself. So it is a little bit different, but I don't I don't know. I worked really hard to use my therapist voice when I'm mad at you. So the fact that you want that crazy psycho voice that I've worked really hard to quiet is dysregulating in and of itself. It's hard.
Yeah.
I think in general, I feel bad for my hubby sometimes. I think it's hard to be with a therapist.
I think it is.
Like he is
My husband is a
super
therapist.
great. And that's extra
I
interesting. That's
know.
a different layer. But like my husband is so, this is going to sound so weird. He's so simple-minded and I'm a very complex thinker. It's why I love this field. There's just new things you're learning every day. He's very simple. And so I try to use these therapy techniques, not even like him being a client, just like things that I've learned that I want to use like in my relationship to handle conflict, things like that. And he's just so simple. Like he's like, it is what it is and let's move on. And I'm like, no, but I want to dissect why you said that. And I want to know why this and why that. And he's like, why? Like, I said this, that it is what it is. Like, let's move on. And so being with it, like, I challenge him all the time. I'm like, well, let's talk deeper about it. He's like, that's as deep as it is. He's like, you hurt my feelings there. And I'm like, no, it's got to be, what is activating you from your childhood? He's like, nothing. But that's like where my mind goes. And I always say, he's like, he's just trained to be a husband of a therapist because he just knows how to stop my overthinking and cut it out. And it's good being with a simple-minded person sometimes.
I feel like for me, the thing you described is kind of like the fawn response for anxious attachment individuals. Because when in my brain, I'm like, well, no, if I can just therapize you enough, I can neutralize the future threat as well.
Right, and I'm thinking about that too.
Yep.
Like and he's just so in the moment, which is really great because
beautiful in so
right,
many
it
ways.
is. It's so refreshing too. Like
just
coming
don't know how to
home,
do that.
I know. Well, same. And I talk all day long. I conceptualize things all day long. So I'm just a very deep thinker. But when I get home, this is why he doesn't suffer with all these ailments because he is a present moment type of dude. Like, and he doesn't hold on to things. And me, I'm like, well, you said that like 3 months ago, and I'm just now it's clicking. And he's like, yeah, but I forgot about what I said 3 months ago. Why are we talking about it? But I just think it's really hard. I go back to, I think it's really hard sometimes to be with a therapist who over explains or over communicates, because I think that's a thing too. Because he's like, I didn't need to know all that. I'm like, well, I thought you needed to know all that. He's like, no, I'm good. But I overdid it once again.
Or they'll just straight up tell you, I don't need you to help me with that. Like, a couple of days ago, I was like, my boyfriend was venting to me, and I'm like, okay, what can you control? Like, what can you, and he's just like, I don't know. And then like we kept talking, he's like, all right, you want to know what I can control? And I'm like, see, like you just have to dive into it. Like, don't just say it's okay. Like, I'll figure it out. I'm like, I want to know, like, what's going to happen in the future? Why are you so upset? Like, what can we do to help you? Not, I'll figure it out. It's fine. Like,
I know, and that's my husband's thing. Though I'll figure it out. I'm like, well, let's figure it out right now. I'll help you with it. I'll help figure it out for you.
head.
Like,
Yeah.
right? It's on my head, but it's not on his.
yours. Yep.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I had to learn in my marriage to ask my husband if he was looking for a listening ear or a helping hand. And I had to learn that very early on because I'm a doer.
Yep.
And we work together, we live together, we are raising children together, we have a very involved, like, extended ecosystem. So we have really close friends and like, we have so many different pieces, and just there were times like he'll have a bad day at work and he wants to come home and like vent about it like normal people do. They just want to vent.
Yep.
But he's venting and I'm sitting here going into like problem solving mode, and I'm starting to think like, oh, well, we could do this, and then what about that? And then maybe we can have this, and then maybe, and he's like, I just want to bitch. I just want to bitch. Quit trying to fix it. I just want to bitch about it.
Yep.
And I think that sometimes, especially in romantic relationships, we become too fixy, helpy. And we lose sight of, like, sometimes you just want to scream into the void
Or let it be.
or let it be.
The thing you were just talking about, the venting, I was thinking about how oftentimes I even sometimes tell clients, this is, you're allowed to vent in therapy, but usually, like, I do a lot of somatic work. So I'm like, let's check in with your body instead. Because
While
sometimes
you're venting.
that can be even more helpful. But I've had to learn venting does have its place. But also then with like my fiance, I've noticed sometimes I'm just not in the headspace to accept that venting. And I had a friend at church, was that yesterday? Yeah, who in his relationship said that him and his partner always ask first when they come home. They're like, "Hey, are you in the headspace to hear a bunch of venting?" Which I'm still tripping over. I'm like, that's a really good idea.
That is a really
to
good
ask,
idea.
like, "Hey, are you in a headspace to hear my venting?" And then for me, as an anxious attachment person, that helps me know that that person said yes, so I don't have to feel bad about
Right.
bitch.
Yeah. And everybody's different too.
important.
Like when I grew up, like my mom, when me and my sister were little, she used to drive over an hour to work every day. So my dad, 45 minutes. And my dad was the one that used to pick me and my sister up. So he would, make us dinner. My mom would come home and she was allowed to vent, bitch, to my dad. And he was like, like he would side with my mom and stuff. So that's what I was used to. That's what I saw growing up. And then the relationship I'm at now, like we were talking about before, my boyfriend drives an hour back from work every day, gets up at 4:30 in the morning. So I had to find out, I probably should have found this out in the beginning of the relationship, but it took a little bit. But he's just like, listen, I love you, but like, you just need to give me a second because like, he would, and especially when I was working from home, I was just chilling all day. I was working, but you have to make sure, I think asking, like you said, is so important because if you had, a tough day, then, coming home and but this one did, like, it's a lot. And my boyfriend made that known, like, listen, like, I love you, but when you come home, when there's something wrong with A, B, and C, like, it's just a lot. So thank you for sharing that. Because I think that's super important to be in the headspace because if you're not, then it's just, I don't want to hear it versus, hey, I'm in this headspace to listen to you right now. Go ahead.
I also think there's going to be a dynamic, and I can't wait for someone to study it, is the work from home partner to the working external to the home partner. And I think we've had those dynamics for many years. And for many years, there were more like social rules surrounding
Right.
it. Like the wife stayed home and the husband worked outside of the
It's
home.
not going to be based on gender anymore.
It's not based on gender anymore at all. And I think that's beautiful. But I do think we're going to continue to see like relational dynamics. And I can remember a time where my husband was working as a student. And I was also a student, but I was outside, like he was in a different phase of his education than I was. So he was just like studenting. And I was like studenting and practicuming and teaching and like all this other stuff. So I peopled all day long and would come home and he sat at home and like worked on assignments all day and talked to no one. And then I would come home with my social resources completely depleted. He came home with his social needs really, really high. And I remember just being like, shut up. Like, I just need to be quiet. I need to be alone. Because I need that. I'm a loud introvert. So I can talk to anyone, I can social it up, but at the end when you leave, like I think I'm a very high masking introvert in that when you leave, I want to lay on my floor, hear nothing, see nobody, and just be. And so I needed that coming home. And then he would be there. I'm like, leave, go anywhere. So I also think there's dynamics in relationships built into that we just don't study, but I think there's a lot of value in it.
In the disability community, there's the phrase, you meet one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. So, like, to be intentional and not assume things, I think it applies to relationships. Never really assume anything.
Right.
Like, almost like the story you were saying, you kind of went into it assuming the same stuff you saw as a kid was going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
When you meet a new person, you just have to ask, okay, what do you like?
Right.
You have to continually ask that.
Yeah.
Before we got started. Oh, how do we support folks in therapy? How do we support folks who come into treatment? And I'm thinking about more in an individual setting. I think so often I'm working with someone who all I do is hear about their relationship through their lens and their perspective, and it's a source of distress for them in psychotherapy. I think doing couples, I mean, I think every couple at some point in their life going to couples therapy is a beautiful way to nurture their relationship. And I know my husband and I, we did premarital therapy and then we went back for a refresher back in 2020 when our lives fell apart. And we've had a significantly better relationship since then. And so it was necessary. I'm a huge proponent of it. But I'm thinking about when we see somebody one on one and we hear about their relationship and their relationship is such a source of distress for them. But yet every week they come in and we're hearing the same distressing narratives over and over again. We're hearing the same distressing patterns over and over again. And they're not at a space where they have any indication that they're going to end the relationship. It's just kind of like distress on distress on distress. What do we do in working with that population? The person that is miserable but stuck or miserable but committed.
That's really hard. As a family therapist, I always end up doing couples together. I'm so interested in that answer.
Well, I mean, I can think of a couple of individuals that have seen recently. Some who have had to politely be like, "So this is the definition of abuse," which always sucks. But then at the same time, you can't. Well, you can, but it's not helpful to be like, you should break up with them as a therapist. But I guess it's kind of leading the client to see their own truth on their own. Like I mentioned, somatic work I really like. And I've heard stories and had clients who, if you just connect them with themselves enough, they'll come up with the answer that they need for themselves. I talk a lot about expectations because I often see people having, I don't want to say inappropriate expectations, but expectations that are disappointed, which I feel like comes from that attachment piece because, I mean, one, like we talked about biologically or evolutionarily, you expect as an infant to be taken care of. And then when that doesn't happen, that's like your life is at risk. And I think infants understand that probably. So that can be really challenging to then later as an adult to have had that experience. But I often just talk to clients about expectations of, well, what are your expectations in this relationship? And then if they're constantly being disappointed, maybe you're expecting something that isn't helpful to expect. I often use the phrase like giving up on hope. Everyone always talks about hope is this great thing and it's cool, and yeah, it is. But at the same time, if you're hoping for your abusive husband to change, don't. Which is when I talk about expectations and then like, oh, well, I can change him. But if I connect the person to their feelings, say it's in that stereotype of abusive husband and the wife that's not connected to her feelings, the minute she starts getting angry and realizes, yeah, this is wrong, that's when she leaves.
That's when the change happens.
Self-awareness. I tell people all the time, I feel like self-awareness would solve half the world's problems. If you would just understand yourself and be aware, then it also means you'd have your own identity outside of the relationship.
Exactly.
But I could think that goes along with earlier what we were talking about too. If all your identity is put into a relationship, it's very hard to see yourself out of it and to see what is wrong. And you're so close and suffocated with all of that. There almost is no way out. You need to step back and be aware of what is going on, even with yourself first. And then you can kind of see everything else. But I think self-awareness is the biggest thing.
So I feel like you, even though you don't really work individually, and you're like, oh, I'm so curious to see the answer. You kind of already knew the answer.
Well, I do work in, like, I do parenting sessions, like, alone, but I always have access to the other one. If they're in a relationship, I'm saying I always have access. So that's why I do individual work, but I also understand the other side of things as well. So I think I'm not gonna say it's always easier, but because I have access to way more people in the system, I feel like therapy just looks so much different. And because I can pull from, well, I just met with dad yesterday and that's not the same thing you're saying now. And, when you're working individually, that's my blind spot. Like, that's why I think outpatient terrifies me personally, just because I'm in the vortex of family based.
And I can't. I did family based for a year and I was like, nope, no.
It's intense, but I like having access to all the different people because in relationships, then I can really see what's going on versus I just hear your opinion, your view, all of you, and it's very hard to then understand everything else. Yeah. So like I said, it's my blind spot. Like I'll work on that in my practicum.
Yeah, but I think like to approach that, like to think about even the example that you just provided of like a abusive husband and a wife that is kind of being perpetrated against. I would also argue that her removing herself from that situation is likely going to be the only thing that's going to support him in achieving change as well. And like if we look at it systemically, like I can think of a client that I had forever. I mean, I think I saw this woman for like 7.5 years. And for the first like 3.5 years she was in, it wasn't a physically abusive relationship, but it was in an insidious relationship where like she was responsible for it. He took advantage of her, I will say. Like he didn't have a job throughout much of their relationship and just kind of like smoked weed and played video games and bebopped around town, living his best life. And meanwhile, she's working 3 jobs and like taking care of the kids. And like I think she used to call him Peter Pan, basically. Like he just never grew up. And so for 3 years, though, I had sort of been her therapist thinking like she's chosen this and she's going to stay in this, and it's my job as a provider to maintain that non-judgmental stance and just kind of point out the ways in which she's continuing to carry his responsibility for him and the ways in which that didn't serve her in other zones. Then one day she comes into therapy like and shocks the shit out of me and says, I'm leaving. And I was like, no, you're not. But she did. She left. I mean, to my knowledge, we've since finished therapy, but we saw each other for about 2.5 years after that. She left, left. Never went back, developed a co-parenting relationship. But after about 1.5 years, then he stopped drinking. He stopped smoking weed. He has this good job now. He's in a relationship with someone else in which he seems to be doing great. And then she's sitting there like, well, why couldn't he do this when we were together? Well, he was never going to do it when you were together because you both brought out the not best in one another. You both created a context where systemically you were feeding the parts of the other that neither of you, that didn't really serve the relationship and didn't serve you in the moment. And when you decided to leave, it shifted the system in a way that he's now been able to find his best version of himself. And it would have been nice if he could do it when he was with you. But that's not how relationships work all the time. And but I remember like for a year, like towards the end, the thing that we were working on is like, I just can't go back to him. And it's like, well, I mean, you do you. I'm not gonna project my values onto you as a provider. But I don't know that he would be who he is today had you all stayed in that same pattern. I don't know that that would have been effective.
Did she have an aha moment?
She did.
Okay, because I had a very similar client a couple years ago, very high publicity case, unfortunately, because the aha moment for that family was the kid committed suicide.
Oh, no.
And that is then what prompted the mom to finally get out of that relationship. And unfortunately, that is what had to happen in order for her to wake up. But, family based, we don't have time on our side. We're not there to make these like huge changes. I mean, we make huge changes, but I'm not there to see like years worth of your life. I'm there for 8 months. So we're just the catalyst to start change. But because we got the case because of the suicide and things like that, that's what prompted the family to come, because then the other siblings were having issues. Ooh. Yeah. But it really a lot of it stemmed from just how toxic the relationship was, but mom just would not leave, like would not. And it wasn't I don't know, it's so hard to say. It wasn't like physical abuse, anything like that, but there were things being taken advantage of, things like that where mom had to put herself in some really risky situations to not only make money, but also make sure the kids were like fed and things like that while dad did other things, and then try to call something a career just so he could be with other women. Yeah, it was a lot of stuff going on. But I don't think, unfortunately, if the child had not done what he did, I feel like mom would still be there. There needed something to snap the whole system into change in some sort. That's why I'm asking if there was an aha moment.
I say an aha moment, and I would say it was more of like a straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay.
So it was, in this particular instance, she lost her job because she had to leave work unexpectedly to go get their kid. And he just fell asleep and didn't go get their kid. And so she left work because she couldn't reach him to get their child. But this had happened before, but she lost her job this time.
Okay.
And I think that, and it was a job she liked. It was a job that she had worked really hard to get. So she lost something important while he was napping. And I think but that had happened before. Like, this wasn't the first time that she had to overcompensate for him because he was taking a nap.
Right.
But in this instance, like, it was just the right series of events.
And it hit her at a spot.
And she just, it was like that, like the scales fell from her eyes or whatever. She just saw it then.
Yeah.
And she was like, no, I can't do this. But I would say 3 years of our treatment leading up to that has been like work around boundaries, work around like communication. How do you set and maintain? And I had kind of in my heart just like, she's gonna take care. Like, this will be her third child until the day she dies, and she's chosen it. And
It's so hard sometimes to sit though and
I
watch.
had to let it go as a
Yeah.
therapist, right? Because you always want these things for your clients,
course.
but at times I was just like, well, maybe he's really nice to her. I don't know. Like, I don't know why you'd stay in that relationship.
No, we had to wait too. I think it took like halfway through treatment for mom to finally leave, and we were just easily talking about things, kind of showing things to her in her face, but never saying like, you need to leave, things like that, until the one day she was just like, we are done. Like, it is time. I think he started trying to grow shrooms in his backyard, and when he got caught, he blamed it on her, and that was the one that she's like, I can't get into. Yep. So then she
in the yard.
He like bought it from like, he called the black market, so he got the fungi spores. Is that how?
You live in a rural area?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then he was able to plant it and stuff. And I don't know if she said it to someone or he said it, but his thing was, I'm trying to do it because you get really bad headaches. Like, this was all for you. And so when police found out, he tried to put it on her and stuff. So that's then what finally like woke her up more. Yep. Yes. And finally, meanwhile, myself and my co-therapist were like, the whole time we're like, God, what is it gonna take for, because it is painful sometimes watching a client go through that. And in family-based, I'm in your home too, so I see like all the dynamics unfolding, and it's very hard sometimes to be in the thick of it while you're sitting there and you're still continuously deciding that this relationship is okay.
It's interesting to me too that some of we've said a bunch of different examples. Some have been very serious, and some maybe not so serious. When you connect a client to themselves, like you had said, that's the
self-awareness
thing.
part.
It doesn't take much. It just takes, he left the knife out on the counter again. And that was the straw that broke, because you're so connected to your own feelings that you realize, oh, yeah.
I agree.
When I find myself curious about the balance of that as well, because I've also worked with clients whose expectations for their partner were so high that no partner could ever like hit that level of so it's always that like, what are your deal breakers? What are the things that within a romantic partnership or relationship are completely like off the table for you? What are the things that you need essentially in a relationship that are really important to be present in a relationship? And then what are the things that you would like, but are maybe not necessarily deal breakers. And I've had other clients over the years that have been like, well, I need a good morning text every time. And I need them to, pull my car out of the garage when it's time for me to get ready in the morning. And I need, whenever I call them, to answer no matter what. And it's like, well, sometimes people have other things they need to do as well. Like, I think it's really important to have standards in relationships, and they can't be responsible for all of our emotional well-being. And how do you find that balance in the middle? Because I can think about, gosh, I wish I would have reread it before today in preparation. But it was it was in the news not that long ago where a celebrity was being accused, it was Jonah Hill, was being accused by his partner for like therapizing her and using like some of his terms from therapy. But she was saying that it was like abuse, that he was using his therapeutic knowledge. Gosh, I should have researched it before I tried to talk about it on a podcast. But basically, and like when I was reading about it, like, I guess he had said, like, he wants to use I statements in conflicts. And I was like, that's not so bad. Like, is that abuse? But she was basically saying, like, no, he's abusing
Like
me.
it's manipulation
He's using
or
this
something.
manipulative knowledge to gaslight me
Oh, wow.
and abuse me. And then I found myself wondering, like, where's the line with that? Because I could see somebody who's been in therapy going to speak with their partner and saying, like, these are my boundaries, and we're all setting boundaries out the gate. We're never perfect with it. These are my boundaries and these are my expectations. But then maybe no one will hit those expectations or boundaries. And I don't know. It's a balance in between, I guess.
And trial and error as well. I think going back to, I know it's not like a broken record, but like beginning attachment and infancy.
It's not a broken record if it's true.
I'm true. I just feel like I say it every single day. That's why. But, growing up and having a close relationship with my dad, the expectations that I was looking for in a partner were the things that my dad was doing. And so or not doing, correct. And then I remember specifically like the first snowstorm after my husband and I got married and we lived together. I woke up regular time to get ready for work because I assumed and expected that he'd clean my car off. My dad did that when I lived at home with him, and he does it for my mom every time. So that was my expectation. So the anger that I felt when I went outside and nothing was done was like, what? But then it started a conversation through trial and error too. Like, that is what I expected. And he's like, well, you never said anything. I'm like, I didn't think I had to. I thought that's what a man does. Like, you clean off your woman's car. Now he wakes up at 4:30 in the morning, he will do my car. But that's because we've had conversations about it. And then, I do things for him in other ways. But I really think that's where two expectations come, and then this is where we hold on to things. And I feel bad for then people. I wonder, like, I had someone in my life where I was able to see expectations, what I do, what I don't want in a significant other. I wonder where, when you have an insecure attachment from your family of origin, where do you get those expectations? Like, where do you figure that out? Is it social media? Is it other friends? And then I think that's also what makes it very challenging, where you have these expectations that are super high because you're watching a show or you're talking to someone and you're like, well, their man does this, this, and this and that, and why don't you do it for me? Like, those kinds of things. But I always wonder that, like, where do you get your expectations from? Like, I don't know, in a relationship. I don't know, kind of piggybacking off of that. I didn't answer that question.
No, I think that's really,
but
and you're coming down to this, I don't know. I read a lot. I'm a big reader. I like to read. I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of fiction about dragons. And so I like fantasy, I like sci-fi, and there's this new blend of romantasy that is built into the fantasy sci-fi world. And I like all of it until the romantasy turns into smut. And like only smut with no plot. And then I'm not interested in those. And so it's hard to sort of stay on this side of that line sometimes. Sometimes I'll get halfway and I'm like, oh, that's not what I thought this was. I have learned some tricks when it comes to the covers. I'll share that not on a podcast. But what I think is interesting about that is that when I'm reading those stories, so often if one member of the dyad would just fucking talk to the other member of the dyad, there would be no book. Like, because they'd say the thing and then they'd say the thing and then the story would be over.
You're right.
But instead, we're just going to keep secret and we're going to have these mind reading expectations and we're going to have, and I think about that a lot when I'm doing couples therapy, when it's like, hey, can you just name your wants? Just name it. Whatever it is you want in this relationship, can you name it? And can we call it a want instead of a need? Because there's a difference.
Yep.
And if you name it to your partner, then your partner has a choice whether or not they're going to fulfill those wants or not. But instead, I think that a lot of relationships, at least those that I see for couples therapy, walk around in their separate spheres with this expectation that you are just inherently going to know what soothes my soul, and you will inherently know what I need, and you will inherently know what my dad used to do for me growing up, right? And
Why don't you know?
How's he to know that, right? That's not fair. But I think we have this like mind reading thing built in, and if you loved me enough, you would just know.
Yeah.
If you loved me enough, you would know what I need intuitively. And I don't know that that's fair.
Right.
I think
Agreed.
that someone can love you fiercely and not know what your childhood trauma needs to thrive.
The inner wounded child. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Because again, self-awareness. If you don't know what your things are, how in the world is your spouse or significant other supposed to know? There's
And
just
was
no way.
and like to use your example, was it about the removing the snow, or was it about like the thinking about me and caring about
That's what it was.
enough to
But
remove
with a
the snow?
simple-minded husband,
I'll get
it's
the
just
snow.
like, yeah, okay, I got you next time. And I'm like, I just wanted to feel cared about, that you took extra time out of your day of waking up at 4:30 every morning. I'm looking at you because you said your boyfriend wakes up at 4:30. That's the time. My hubby's up too. Yeah. So the fact that you didn't wake up 15, 20 minutes earlier than that forbidden hour of the night to clean off my car. But yeah, it was more about that. But communication, self-awareness, those are the things. Yeah.
So one of the things that we do here at the How to Be Happy Hour is that we accept questions for our panelists. So anybody who has a question, you are welcome to submit that at kim@howtobehappyhour.com. We do have a couple upcoming topics. We have quite a few upcoming topics. So season 3 is all about relationships. We're going to dive into the therapeutic relationship. We've already looked at friendships, so that was one of our previous pods. But what other podcast do we have? We have another romantic relationships pod coming up. We're going to do one explicitly on the apps because I just have to. I really want to talk about the apps and dating in that space. We're going to look at parent-child relationships and parent-child dynamics for both adult parent-child dynamics as well as parent-child with littles. We're going to do one on cousins, because I think cousins are one of the most unique relationships that exist. At least they have been for me. So I want to do a cousins pod and all other relationships. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please submit them to the howtobehappyhour.com. But one of the questions that I wanted to chat about a little bit here today, and we haven't kind of naturally found ourselves in this place, is how do mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, or other mental health diagnoses play into our romantic relationships and our satisfaction and connection in our romantic relationships?
As a neurodivergent individual, again, that could be a whole podcast on its own.
Yes.
About neurodivergent relationships. I feel, a lot of autistic individuals are very, they often say what they mean, which can sometimes be helpful. So then, you're not really lying in a relationship and you're saying, I want this or I need this. It's just interesting being in a neurodivergent relationship. ADHD can be a big struggle in relationships too.
I'm not laughing. I'm laughing for my husband.
Oh, yeah, no, I am also laughing for myself and my fiance.
My husband fell over our dishwasher the other day because I left it open. It was not a good moment in the Ernest household. But yes, ADHD can strain relationships.
Strains relationships, and like rejection sensitivity dysphoria is not like an actual diagnosis, but like I've really struggled with that, et cetera, et cetera. And we've already talked a lot about, trauma or any attachment wounds can make that a challenge. There's something else I was going to say, but I forget what it was about neurodivergent relationships. Maybe I'll think of it.
No, I think the trauma piece is huge. And I think that those trauma pieces will play out in those relationships ongoing.
Yeah, for sure. And they've done studies with autistic people where they can't tell if they're autistic or have CPTSD, which sucks because they're finding out, that our world is not built for neurodivergent people. So just the fact of being neurodivergent means you're traumatized by living, which can make relationships even more harder. But then, I feel like we've talked a lot. You mentioned a couple things about gender norms that I feel like gender norms kind of hurt everyone in a sense. Like when we talk about DEI and we talk about, better accommodations for disabled people will help non-disabled people. I think it's the same thing with LGBTQ stuff. Like better, or I should say, less norms about gender would help some of the things that you were talking about.
So true.
Like the man cleans off my car. Well, and then the Venn diagrams between LGBTQ and autism and ADHD is like a circle.
There's a lot.
So it's really hard to talk about one without talking about the other. And just being neurodivergent of any kind, you're probably naturally going to bulk against gender norms, which then kind of throws the whole relationship thing into maybe a good chaos, I would feel like. But
Oh, and I think just to take that to the nth degree is depending on your socialization and depending on the gender norms and depending on the dynamics in the household in which you grew up. Like I've shared this before, and hopefully, one of my very best friends growing up ended up in their late 20s transitioning female to male after being married to a man for many years in a cis normative relationship and having extreme depression, extreme suicidality, being on a meds list a mile long, like all these different things. And at the time, his husband was the most lovely man. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't a bad relationship. They're friends today. They vacation together with their new partners, but like they had to find that rhythm, and
you have to know yourself.
You have to know yourself. And I think my friend, also neurodivergent, but also was very separate from their own internal world and had decided, like, this is how I'm supposed to live because growing up in the 80s, this is what you do, right? And so I remember it was on my 26th birthday, I got a call from them and they said, hey, I'm leaving my husband, and oh my goodness, like I was a little shocked, but okay. And I'm going to be a man. And I was like, oh, okay. Okay. And I had known about the mental health. I had known about the therapy. I had known about the hospitalizations. I had known how deeply they were hurting. And truly, it changed everything. It changed everything when they went from living as they were supposed to be living to living as they were meant to be living. And it broke everything else fell apart after. Like it fell apart, but then it came back together in the most beautiful way. And so I guess that leads into another question that was submitted for today's pod is how does societal norms, cultural expectations, how does that influence our relationships and our satisfaction in those relationships? At least for that example, they lived their life consistent with expectations and they were suicidal. And then one day they're like, your expectations, and they found a beautiful, just got married again, like really living their best life today, but
I feel like
when they let it go.
Right. And I feel like even when if I look back at my life, every time I've tried to fit into the norm is when I've felt the least satisfaction in life. Trying to fit yourself into a bubble that society says is what you should be doing. It made me afraid of marriage, made me afraid of sex, and made me afraid of a lot of things because also too growing up in a very sheltered Pentecostal household, I think also. The religious expectations too that I had growing up made me afraid of religion, you know? And so I left the church at 15, didn't come back until 2020. And now I'm forever grateful I have, but I've also found a church that fits my vibe, it fits my truth, you know, and I feel wholeheartedly connected with. But I really think that societal norms causes mental health issues overall when you are trying to fit into that. And then also, too, you're comparing yourself to society, and comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah.
There's just no way. If you're comparing yourself to other people, other relationships, you're always going to find something that you're lacking, you know? And so when we can get rid of those norms, those societal pressures, which I know is very difficult to say, but when we can get rid of those ideas, I feel like people live in their truth and feel so much better overall.
That sucks, though. Like you were saying, it's so hard to get rid of the societal norms. Reminds me of that joke with the two fish, and the one fish is like, "How's the water today?" And the other one's like, "What?"
Yeah.
Because you don't realize it when you're in it.
Right. No, I agree. And then you grow up a certain way, like my parents, both virgins, like, and then got married, produced me. And so this is the expectation that I had to live up to. Like, well, we were both virgins when we got married, and this is what the God says, and this is what the Bible says, and this is what this. And I'm not coming at the Bible, you know. But these are then the things then that I had like at the back of my head constantly into every relationship, everything, until I finally just released myself of that around 15. And not that I had my stuff together at that age, thought I did. But it did allow me, though, to like just break free a little bit. And my parents would have called it rebelling. I look at it now and I'm like, because I didn't go to church. That was my rebelling. And I came home like past midnight a couple times. Like that was, because I always tell my parents, I'm like, you have no idea what rebelling is. Like,
I would go to
no
church and
idea.
then smoke weed on the roof of the church. So
That's hilarious. So that's what my parents probably thought I was doing. Yeah.
Because my parents didn't ask where I was going if I was going to church. So you get away with a
Oh my
lot
gosh,
at church.
that's hilarious.
If no one's looking, like if you don't fight
agree.
them, just go.
I agree.
And then no one pays attention once you walk through the
Yep.
doors. So I'd walk in the front door, walk out the back door.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
And when people smell weed, no one looks up. So we would go to the roof.
That's hilarious. Oh my gosh.
But back to societal
Yeah.
expectations.
I think social media has such a big part on like the norms too. Like if you just get off for a little bit, it makes such a difference. And then, you know, sometimes for me, you kind of look at your partner like, okay, like why aren't we at this point of our life yet? Because so many other people are. And then it's almost like, well, it's not because they're, you know, not a good partner. It's just we're not there yet.
Right. And that's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. But I think social media has made such a difference over the years of like getting everything done, or how am I supposed to be treated? Will this one's be? So I think that's a huge thing is the social media too.
Absolutely. I think there are, you know, with social media, the good part, I guess, coming through is I do see different influencers, like neurodivergent ones or ones that are in polyamorous relation, like just different people that are just outside of the norm that I think give different perspectives. But do I think it's the majority? Probably not. But I do think the positive side of that is if you are in a very restrictive kind of environment, a sheltered environment, social media could give you an outlet to be like, you know what, that person seems like me and they're not doing it the way
Right,
society's doing. So I think there might be a positive spin somewhat to it a little bit.
Representation. There's
Yes,
also
representation, absolutely. Which I think could be helpful for those people who just have never met anyone like them and they're like, is something wrong with me? And then they start seeing people on social media. They're like, no, these people are doing the same stuff, having the same things. Like, I'm normal. I'm totally, I hate using that word. Let me not use that, but I'm totally fine. You know, I just think differently, or I don't want what that person
Right.
wants in life. And that's okay. You know?
I do also think that we are living during we try not to get too terribly political on this podcast, but I think we are living in a season where this is a part of the conversation in a really polarized way. And in a way that when I think about like children and adolescents growing up during this decade or during this, like what are kids right now? Like my kids are Gen Alpha, and I guess we just had the baby born now.
Yes,
Gen
beta. That's what my
right?
baby is.
So my kids still fall in the alpha generation, but just sort of, and I think that they do have a lot of really healthy, like non-cisgender normative examples in their lives. Like we have friends whose like beloved uncle is married to a guy, and my son who's 9 and was obsessed with that actress from Rise of Red. So I'm pretty sure he at least likes girls a little bit at some point. But he has told me like, when I grow up, I think I want to marry a man. That just seems a lot easier than being married to a woman. And I'm like, there's a lot of ways where that won't be easy, my friend. But yeah, but like to him, it's just like that, like
But in his world right now,
in
that
his
makes
world
sense.
and what he's exposed to, that's just a norm. Like we don't
Yeah.
talk about it like, oh, well, so and so's uncle's different because no, it just that's Uncle so and so, and it just is. You know what I mean? There's not like these big, deep conversations around it. It's just life, and this is how some people live, and this is how other people live, and life is beautiful no matter how you choose to live it. But I do
Absolutely.
think we live in a culture right now where there's a lot of really strong opinions, and those who have those strong opinions also tend to have the loudest voices. And my fear is how that will impact people's ability to be authentic and live congruently with their truth moving forward, because there's a lot of noise. I get noise, chatter. There's a lot of pieces there that I do think long term could really influence people's socialization and an ability to live authentically and congruently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, our last question, the last thing that came up, and I thought it was another really interesting one and a place that we have not spent much time on here today, is surrounding this concept of trust or recovery after a significant relationship rupture. So, we've talked about romantic relationships in theory and attachment and some of those different pieces. There are times where couples are called to rebuild trust or connection following like dishonesty or infidelity or a significant rupture within the attachment relationship. And so, from y'all's perspectives, what are some ways in which individuals can recover from that or strive towards a meaningful relationship in the aftermath of those experiences?
Communication is huge. Being able to sit down with somebody and being like, hey, I mean, if it was you that was doing dishonest or whatever, might not be easy to own up to something that happened, but I think overall communication is key, because if you just keep pretending it didn't happen, or even if your partner is like, we don't want to talk about it right now, it's just going to keep getting left under the rug and not talked about. I think the first step is definitely communication.
I think at the same time, there's this balance with also giving time and not trying to rush things, especially if you're like, I'm so obsessed and I love this person so much, you just want to fix it. And sometimes you can't.
Right, yeah.
And then, communication and giving time to grieve, depending especially on how big the rupture was. I think a lot of people look at grief as, oh, well, somebody has to die for me to have grief. And that's not, you experience grief all the time.
Grief of expectations that you thought.
Yeah, exactly. And then, even learning about the stages of grief or whatever, and then applying that to the grief of expectations. Yeah, I'm really angry that this person did blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And holding space for that.
Absolutely. I think too, when you do come about the other side of a rupture and you have forgiven, I think it needs to be something where you're not throwing it in the person's face too. Like I've seen a lot of that with the couples I work with and the families I work with, where they chose to get over infidelity. Someone wasn't faithful, right? They worked through it. They were like, all right, we're going to get through this. Years later, the other one is still bringing it up. So they're re-rupturing the rupture. And I'm not saying forgive and forget, right? Like I know those things are really hard to forget, and that still is held tightly to someone. But if you're going to decide to work through that rupture, then you're going to decide to work through it. And if it is something that needs to be brought up, it needs to be brought up in a very safe manner where you guys can just talk about it and express like, I don't know why, I just can't get it off my head. Like, I know I've forgiven you years ago, but it's still coming up. What is coming up? Why is it coming up? Self-awareness piece again. What is it that for me that I'm still holding on to this and I'm still using it in every argument chance I can get? Because I often see that.
It's weaponized.
Yes.
It becomes like almost a mic drop or a,
Right.
And I've often been like, I think time is so essential
Yeah.
in supporting a couple after infidelity. And then at a certain point, it has to be not all conflicts will take us back here every
Right.
time. Like there has to be a point in the relationship that's more forward focused, but we fall back
Exactly.
and almost like, well, nothing I do matters because you cheated. So there's also like this layer, at least when I've
Yep.
seen it show up problematically, it's in that space of like, well, at least I didn't cheat on you.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, you didn't, and that's great, but it's not helpful right now in this place.
I've seen that too. Like the others, I've seen it where the other person then can do almost every single thing wrong in a relationship, but infidelity.
Yes.
But because the other person did it, it hangs over their head, and they're like, "Well, as long as I can do A, B, and C, as long as it's not Z, I should be forgiven for this because I forgave you for that." So I've seen a lot of conflict with couples because of that, and just constantly overgoing the same, they're re-traumatizing themselves over and over and over again. But then I wonder too, when that happened, should they have taken that space apart to grieve what happened and then come back? But what happens when you have kids, you have a life together, the rent needs to be paid, you only have enough money for one house. When do you take space? When do you decide to grieve that moment and the grieving of those expectations that were lost? Like, how do you do that? you know?
And I've seen couples come back and have a stronger relationship after infidelity. Like I have seen couples come out the other side, and the infidelity in those relationships were viewed like more as a symptom than the disease. Like the infidelity was a symptom of disconnection. And I've seen those relationships often go on to have like beautiful, fruitful next seasons of their relationship. I've also seen a lot of dumpster fires come out of infidelity. Like I've seen couples that have had infidelity in the relationship, and like what you just mentioned, where it's conflict, like all roads lead back to that infidelity, and that's where every fight goes. I've seen couples then say, oh, well, we can't seem to have faithful, and usually it's like one member of the dyad is unable to maintain fidelity. So then I've seen couples say like, well, we're going to try an open relationship, and usually there's extra, like they almost move into an open relationship out of duress,
Which is not good.
which is not a good solid foundation on which to build an open relationship.
See, that's what I see. I personally haven't seen the other side where it's been good, which I'm glad that is possible, because I don't know, I just haven't with the years that I've worked with couples with infidelity specifically.
I mean,
It's
few
very
and far
difficult.
between. I mean, I'll be truthful. I would say most often, if I'm working with a couple that is coming in due to infidelity, I would say more often than not, the therapy had turned into co-parenting therapy as we went on. Like, and basically, and I tell every couple I work with, like, when we start out, I say, I don't know what our work's going to be here today. And as we go on, if I'm here to help us remain in the relationship, then that's the work I'm going to do. It may be that I'm called to support you in ending your relationship well. And if that's our work, then that's our work, and that's the direction we can go with it as well. I would say often, in more often than not, when I'm working with a couple in the immediate aftermath of infidelity, that's where the relationship is going. But I've had enough over the course of my career that I still have hope.
Good.
Like I still offer it as an option.
You just
I guess,
gave me
when
some
I do an
hope.
intake. Yeah.
I don't know. When I walk into a family and that's kind of like the premise of what has hurt their relationship and now hurting their children, it's usually a dumpster fire, unfortunately. But then I focus on the co-parenting and, also getting space. Like, does someone need to move out? Can you live separately or whatever, because you guys are taking a toll on your children. So
Screaming at each other constantly.
yeah.
Wow. Anything left unsaid? Any other bits, pieces, anything from romantic? We have another romantic relationships pod come up. We're going to do a whole one on the app. I think at some point I'm going to try to do a neurodivergence relationships one, because I think that would be really cool.
That's so cool.
My husband will come on and be like, that bitch leaves the dishwasher open all over it and spill my coffee everywhere.
We have two ADHDers in our house, so like I can't really fault him for half of it, because then I do the same things,
No,
happens all the time. So we just laugh at each other.
walks into the why are all the cupboards open? I don't know, babe.
My husband does
Where I
that.
left him.
That's something I won't do, but my husband does it, and I've knocked my head on it before. Yeah.
I heard a metaphor recently that I really liked, comparing people to hedgehogs or porcupines. That porcupines have spikes on them, right? But in order to survive the winter, they all need to like huddle together to be warm, but they have spikes. And that I really vibe with that and thinking about relationships like I need you, but also Al.
That's cute.
And I don't know.
There's no way for them to like put their spikes in.
I don't know how true the story is.
Okay.
But it's a cool metaphor.
It is.
And I don't know. I feel solace, I guess, or it's comforting to know that idea of like all human beings need relationships.
Yeah.
Like sometimes we can get stuck in the, oh, this is so terrible, this is so sad, but like, no, you're meant to have relationships and it'll all work out fine. Maybe, yeah, figure out how to pull your spikes in.
Right. Momentarily, because you need them. You do need
I'll be
them.
doing a deep dive on hedgehogs.
I know. I want to research now too and be like,
Better
is it?
understand
I love that.
the scientific accuracy of that. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming and joining me
you.
here today. A few upcoming podcasts for anybody who wishes to submit a question. So we've got relationships. We're going to look at the therapeutic relationship from the client point of view, which I think should be fun. We're going to dive into adult-child dynamics. And we're going to do a coworkers pod. So we're going to look at all the different ways all our different important relationships serve us or impede us in our quest for joy. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.